So what is the difference between concepts and metaphors? In order to grasp this contrast, we ought to pay attention to it within the context of Nietzsche's overall work. And so, as I said in the previous video, which you can check on the link above, Nietzsche's work can be summarized into 5 theses. The first one is that life is tragedy and chaos, a meaningless flow of becoming. Now, faced with this tragedy and chaos, human beings are incapable of looking into its eyes, and therefore they create all sorts of coping mechanisms of theoretical buildings, spiritual beliefs, etc. that allow them to try and restrain that chaos. And that's why they resort to science, religion, and philosophy, all of which are symptoms of the human inability to cope with that tragedy and chaos rather than solutions to it. Language underlies all of these endeavors: science, religion, and philosophy. Language is the instrument that they all utilize to try and make sense of reality. In particular, Nietzsche's thinking about metaphors versus concepts are going to be encapsulated in an early work. So as you can see here, this is the timeline of Nietzsche's works, and his reflections apropos metaphors and concepts come in On Truth and Lie in an Extramoral Sense, which is a very short piece that was published just 1 year after his first main work, after the birth of tragedy in 1872. He insists in this idea that we don't grasp things in themselves, but rather as we make sense of them, amongst other ways through language. And so he says, and I quote, "The thing in itself, for that is what pure truth without consequences would be, is quite incomprehensible to the creators of language," meaning human beings, "and not at all worth aiming for. One designates only the relations of things to men, and to express them one calls on the boldest metaphors. A nerve stimulus, first transposed into an image, first metaphor. The image, in turn, imitated by a sound, second metaphor. And each time there is a complete overleaping of one sphere right into the middle of an entirely new and different one." So what Nietzsche is saying here is pretty clear. We don't grasp things as they are in themselves. We don't grasp what Kant called phenomenon, but rather things as they appear to us, the so-called phenomena in Kantian terms, right? Now, the way we do this, the way we grasp phenomena through language is via metaphors. And there are a couple of metaphors that take place from the very moment we see an object until we come up with the word related to that object as it appears to us as human beings. And so this would be more or less the process. You see, we have the objects. Those objects impact our nervous system via our perception of them. And then from that impact on the nervous system, we create an image of that object. That is the first metaphorization, that transition between the nervous system and the image. And then from that image, we create a word. And that is the second metaphorization, from the image to the word. Or as Nietzsche puts it, and I quote, "We believe that we know something about the things themselves when we speak of trees, colors, snow, and flowers. And yet, we possess nothing but metaphors for things. Metaphors which correspond in no way to the original entities. In the same way that the sound appears as a sound figure, so the mysterious X of the thing in itself first appears as a nerve stimulus, then as an image, and finally as a sound. Thus, the genesis of language does not proceed logically in any case, and all the material within and with which the man of truth, the scientist, and the philosopher later worked and built, if not derived from Never Never Land, is at least not derived from the essence of things. So again, the idea that we do not possess things in themselves, but metaphors of them, and that's all the raw material with which the scientists, the philosophers, and the people of religion can work with. So here's the best possible summary, I think, about the transition between metaphors to concepts and then back to metaphors according to Nietzsche. Now, the first idea to understand is that over time, the metaphors that we use, that were just described in the quotes that I referred to, turn into concepts. Now, the price of a concept is overlooking the individual and actual differences. So the result is that the concepts we end up with are far removed from reality. And from that perspective, they're useless, they're false, and they are illusions. Illusions of order, Apollonian illusions, versus the chaos, the tragedy of the underlying reality. Consequently, Nietzsche says, concepts are actually metaphors whose origins as such we have forgotten. We have taken the result as its own cause, forgetting that that result, the concepts, are just universalizations of individual, specific, bold metaphors that preceded those concepts. Therefore, we cannot and should not take concepts for granted. Rather, what we have to do, Nietzsche says, is to interrogate what they conceal, the history of their evolution, their genealogy, the things that they occult and the things that are negated and the suppressed differences that these concepts contain. Precisely because they come from metaphors, which they now suppress as concepts. And this sounds very abstract, but it's actually fairly specific if you think about it. For instance, in my PhD thesis, I discussed the concepts of democracy, terrorism, and constitution in contemporary Spain. Now, you might think that the definition of these three, democracy, terrorism, and constitution, is self-evident, right? Wrong. Because they are concepts, Nietzsche would say, qua concepts, they actually hide underneath a lot of contradictions and tensions and metaphors that have evolved over time and which we need to interrogate, rather than taking the resulting concepts, democracy, terrorism, and constitution at face value. So for the purpose of this illustration, we can actually have a look at an article I recently published this year that is related to my PhD thesis. And its title, as you can see, is Terrorism, Democracy, and the Spanish 1978 Constitution. Transitional Concepts, Post-Transitional Metaphors. The idea is that these three concepts, terrorism, democracy, and constitution, were during the process of the so-called Spanish transition to democracy between 1975 and 1982, reified, objectified, consolidated, established canonically as concepts, and that it is incumbent upon us to explore the contradictions and tensions that underlie those concepts, and to see if those metaphors that they contain and that have been forgotten over time could lead to different interpretations, to different political forms of life, hence post-transitional metaphors. So as you can see in the abstract, in the article in question, I argued that during the Spanish transition, there was a gradual semantic displacement that would strongly condition the way politicians and people in mass media use the terms terrorism, democracy, and constitution. They use them as if they designated self-evident realities, but actually as concepts, and just like Nietzsche would have it, they conceal ontologically unstable and socially constructed entities. So while the meaning of democracy, terrorism, and constitution have been actually hotly debated as part of that transitional process since 1975 until 1982, by the end of 1982, democracy had been reduced, oversimplified, reified, objectified as a mere reform of, rather than a break with, the Franco regime. Terrorism, for its part, had been reduced, reified, objectified into any form of sub-state political violence as opposed to state political violence. And the so-called constitution was now widely understood as a sacrosanct foundation of the current quote-unquote democratic order. And this of course has very important repercussions because it means that since 1982, real and fabricated quote-unquote terrorist attacks, because then again the definition as terrorist depends on a concept that conceals many tensions about different understandings of it, have been constantly instrumentalized to reinforce by opposition the reified and objectified concepts of quote-unquote democracy and quote-unquote constitution. And what my article does is it traces the tensions that underlie the discursive articulation of these concepts. So in other words, what I'm saying is that since 1982, terrorism, democracy, and the 1978 quote-unquote constitution have been predominantly used in Spanish mainstream discourse as conventionalized dead metaphors whose discursively contested origins between 1975 and 1982 seem to have been conveniently forgotten in order to further the state's governance of Spain. And so from this perspective, the quote-unquote truth about post-transitional terrorism, democracy, and the 1978 constitution in Spain as portrayed in Spanish mainstream historiography and culture is, to say with Nietzsche, and I quote, mobile army of metaphors, which, after long usage, seem to a nation fixed, canonical, and binding. Truths are illusions of which one has forgotten that they are illusions, worn out metaphors which have become powerless to affect the senses. So that's all for me. I hope the explanation as to the difference between metaphors and concepts in Nietzsche is clear. Metaphors are what human beings can resort to within language that allows us to refer to the chaos and tragedy of life, whereas concepts are just reified, objectified versions of metaphors that prevent us from comprehending the complexity that lies underneath, which is why we need to be more skeptical towards concepts in our everyday life and interrogate them to analyze their intrinsic tensions and the genealogy of their discursive articulations. Let me know what you think about the video in the comments down below, and as always, thanks for watching.